situation within, when you start to become analytical in psychology and particularly how it applies to our people. We have a brother that we always look to who had started off with looking at the developmental psychology of the black child and now has gone on to deal with black on black crime, which we hear is a myth. Some people try to help us and say it's a myth, but is it a myth? In South Africa they want to talk about black on black crime, so we could show who is responsible for it, but it's still not a myth. And so when Amos Wilson wrote Black on Black Crime, the psychodynamics of black self-annihilation in the service of white domination, he wrote a masterpiece. So will you welcome at this time Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate your invitation, and it's a pleasure indeed to share the platform with such distinguished guests and to appear before you, this audience. It's been quite some time, and it's good to be back. Of course, there are times that I sort of have to take a break from the situation to sit and renew my thoughts and to sort of try to put on the written records some of the rationales that we may need to pursue our advancement as a people. I am currently involved in writing on the subject matter of the education of the black child, a rationale for an African-centered education. So if you don't see me too often, it's not because I've given up at all, it's because I'm just dedicating myself to this movement in a way that I think is in line with my talents. So I'm still with you. Now the evening, of course, is passing very rapidly, so I will not consume a great deal of your time, and I will just sort of run through the outline of the text of my speech that I had prepared here today, dealing with the black adolescents and black on black violence. And of course, I congratulate Brother Lambe for the title here, How White Society Promotes Violence Within the African Community. I often, in talking to students, try to get our students to understand the political game behind courses in the universities and in our schools that appear to be superficially non-political. And I try to get them to understand that everything is political, that there even is a politics of science, so that we can talk about a black physics and black chemistry and black mathematics and black engineering and the whole bit, because all of these things occur within a political, social context to achieve political and social ends. And when you are taught those courses, whether it's engineering or mathematics or what have you, without those courses being connected to a political context, then you are being politicized, and you're being politicized in a way to support the dominant system, and in this instance to support white domination. So it becomes very important that whatever we talk about it in context, because the major ruse that is used in the academies is to decontextualize subject matter. That is, to take subject matter out of context and to project it as race neutral and objective. So, as a matter of fact, when you read your newspapers, you will see the same kind of game going on. You will get discussions of black on black violence, the homicide among our young men, and you will get half explanations or half truths, such as these young men are killing each other because of the availability of guns. You know, somehow it's just the mere availability of guns that's causing black-on-black homicide, or just the selling of drugs, or other half explanations. We have to watch out for that, because often the other half is the most important one, the one that is left out. How are the guns distributed? Who manufactures them? Who sells them? And the whole bit. Who imports the drugs? Who distributes the drugs? Or it's the cause of poverty. Crime is caused by poverty, caused by poor family background. We get a whole plethora of these kind of half-truth definitions. These guns are made available within a social political context. Drugs are made available within a social political context. Families are broken apart within a social political context. Poverty is created within a social political context. Poor education is the result of a social political context, ladies and gentlemen. And we must constantly then look at that context and see how it creates the conditions of which we complain so much. We must then recognize, as we begin to look at black upon black violence, we must see that violence and its connections to a racist society. And we must come to understand what a racist society is about. We use that term so often without analyzing it very well. And we must recognize essentially then that a racist society is about structuring social and political, economic circumstances, psychological and cultural circumstances, such that one race can take advantage of another, and one race can enhance itself at the expense of another. It has little to do with overt race hatred, or with negative racial attitudes, or with the projection of racial stereotypes, or as Brother Harris says, with whites not understanding the nature of their racism. That's not it. And when you define it in terms of attitude, you'll find yourself then solving the wrong problems. These people will stop expressing those negative attitudes, you see. They will smile more regularly at you. They will even marry you and go to bed with you, sleep with you. But you will note that the effects of racism, the effects of poverty, and all of these other things will continue. But not only do they continue, they increase. Ultimately, you must recognize that racism involves the power of one race to impose its will upon another. That ultimately then it is about power. And we have to face that fact. Whites engage in racism because they have the power to do so. And if we are to end white racism, then we must end white power. We use the word imperialistic society and imperialism often, also without looking at it very deeply and looking at the term very deeply. Imperialism of empire. Speaking then of a group of people who through various means have acquired and maintained an empire, who maintain and exploit control over populations much larger than themselves. We heard a reference here tonight about this population being 5%, the white population here of the world, and about the total European population being about 10%, yet in control of 80% of the world's economic resources and in control of the other 90% of the world's populations. You're talking about empire then, ladies and gentlemen. And what does that imply? That means then you have a small population that is ruling over populations that are much, much, much larger than it is. And of course, we don't have time to talk about the psychology of this, but I've often indicated that this can only be possible when that small population maintains the larger populations in a state of false consciousness and in a state of deception. That this small population can only maintain control over those larger populations by outright lying and the falsification of reality. But recognize, in essence then, in terms of the problems we are talking about here this evening, the Colin Powells, the black soldiers in the armies, you have to recognize that the essential nature of imperialism is that due to the fact that the imperialist group or nation that runs the empire is so small compared to the empire, it must of necessity recruit from the very population it rules in order to control that empire. When you study the history of imperialism, particularly the history of imperialism as regards African people, which has been going on now for over 2,000 years, when you look at the history of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent, and you study Chancellor Williams' books, and you look at the history of imperialism in Africa, you cannot help but recognize that non-European imperialism and European imperialism has been aided by Africans who were recruited into the armies of the imperialistic masters and were used to practice black upon black violence against their African brothers in the name of their European masters. So then when I talk about black upon black violence in this book, or we talk about the young men and women in the U.S. Army today, recognize then that we are talking about nothing new, but something that is continuous with the very essence and nature of imperialism and racism. Recognize also that when we talk about black on black violence, we are talking about a violence that violence produced. That black upon black violence is reflective of white on black violence. And that ultimately it reflects the violence that this Eurocentric and European community has practiced upon black people and our reactions to that violence. When we then talk about a racist society, an imperialistic society, recognize then that we are talking about a crimogenic society. What do we mean by crimogenic society? Of course, racism is a crime against humanity and a crime against our race. Imperialism is a crime against our race as well. And therefore, when you have a racist society and an imperialistic society, you have a crimogenic society. What do we mean then by a crimogenic society? Of course, dealing with the word Genesis, we are talking about the idea of generating the beginning, as in the word Genesis, to begin, the source of, the point of creation of. So when we talk about this society as a crimogenic society, we are talking about this society then as the source of crimes, as the generator of criminality, as the creator of criminals, a society that is run by criminals, and a society then that ultimately criminalizes its population. and criminalizes the total system. I had a piece here, you know, there's some of you here who are middle class and you think you're nice. You think you're non-criminal. A criminal society criminalizes all of its constituents. I don't have time tonight to read to you the justification for that piece. Oh, there's some of you who've been in the church and you think you're good. Read in Black on Black Violence where I talk about your dumb goodness. A goodness that maintains sin and criminality. We don't have time to talk about it tonight. You're in the church, but you're guilty too. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, when the leadership of a nation lies to that nation, when it deceives that nation, when it miseducates that nation and falsifies facts, it falsifies the consciousness of the people who inhabit that nation. And when it falsifies their consciousness, it recruits those of its people into its criminality. So whether you know it or don't know it, you're a part of the game. Oh yes, we have to confront our responsibility for this criminal situation as well. Yes, we do. Whether you're looking at us as so-called middle class, remember those of you who are making it in this society, who are making great profits, great accomplishments, sitting at the same tables with your white masters. That you're sitting and profiting from the death and murder and destruction of your ancestors. That as you eat with your white masters, you are eating the flesh and spirits of your people. You can cover it up and lie to yourself and claim it's your individual striving that got you where you're going. That you are taking advantage of opportunities. But remember, these opportunities were based on the death and destruction of African people and the continuing death and destruction of African people. Those of you rolling around in the church and carrying on in the same position as well. But let me continue. This society is a society of criminals, run by criminals, and it is a creator of criminals. And we must recognize it. And I have to say that because we got some people out here who say, I want my children to be just like them. That's the ultimate goal. I don't want there to be any differences. What are you talking about? You want them to be enslavers, rapists, and robbers, and killers, and murderers, and imperialists, and so forth, just like the other folk, right? Think again, ladies and gentlemen. But due to our time, I'm just going to have to rush through here. I accuse the society of being a crimogenic society, a criminal society. A society that engages in white on black violence for a number of reasons. And of course, as you can tell often the psychology of an individual or people in terms of their origins and early childhood experiences, you can look at then the psychology of a people in terms of their origins and early childhood of their race. And when we look then at the origins of this society, we must immediately recognize that it is a society founded on criminal activities. Yes, and that is its inheritance today. It is still a part of it. A society that is a crimogenic society and a society that engages on white on black violence because it is founded on the murder and theft of Indian peoples and Indian lands. It is a crimogenic society, a criminal society, and a society that practices white on black violence because it is a society founded on the kidnapping of African people, the manslaughter of African people in the Mid-Passage, the extortion from African people of their labor, and the enslavement of African people. Therefore, the very nature and foundations of this society rest on two massive genocidal crimes, and this original crime is a part of its nature today. It is a crimogenic society because this group of people cannot face their own criminality. They must engage in the psychology of denial and repression and distortion. And this denial and distortion and repression must suffuse throughout the total society, throughout its total institutions, throughout its total values, and therefore ultimately it must pervert its total population. It is a criminal society and a white on black violent society because it engages in the crime of breach of contract. It has breached the contract of its constitution. It breached the contracts it made with African people during the Reconstructions. It breached its contracts of the 14th, 15th, and other amendments. It breached its contracts in reversing its rulings in the 1860s, 1870s, 1980s, and 1990s. It breached its contract in terms of sharecropping, the peonage of our people, going back on the 40 acres and a mule, and all the rest of the things. It is a criminal society because it constantly engages in assault and battery against its black populations. It engaged in historical lynching, and behind the walls, as my brother mentioned here, of prisons, it still now engages in legal lynchings of African people. It engaged in clan terrorism, which it still engaged in today. It engages in race riots where it destroys the African people. It engages in police riots, and it engages in police brutality where over 300 or more of our young men and women have been destroyed in the city of New York alone. It is a criminal society, and it is a crimogenic society, and a society that engages in white on black violence because it is indicted on the charges of official malfeasance when it revokes its mandate in terms of giving justice to its people and makes its justice system an instrument of injustice, when its so-called rehabilitative system is a school for criminality. It engages in official malfeasance when it rigs its juries, when it legally lynches the ones it so woefully sentences. It engages in official malfeasance when it engages in gerrymandering of black districts, when it betrays the mandates of black voters, when it builds, as my brother mentioned here, prisons as industries so that the incarceration of black men becomes a profit-making industry and a means by which the ruling class makes war against the subordinate classes. It engages in criminal activity, and it is a criminal society when it engages in unfair labor practices, job discrimination, when at the end of the Reconstruction there were more black skilled workers than there were whites, and the whites unionized to keep the blacks from taking advantage of the opportunities that were available to them. It is indicted for labor racketeering when it runs black men away from its construction sites. When we go into a black community where housing is supposedly being made and built for black residents, and we see few, if any, black men building those houses. And when those black men come to work on those sites, they are chased away by the police and the construction workers. And when they are chased away and made to stand on the corners, then they are accused of refusing to work and desiring not to work. We accuse this society of being a crimogenic society, of being a criminal organization, of being an organization that engages in chronic white-on-black violence, when it engages in drug trafficking, when it imports the drugs that poisons our neighborhoods and destroys the consciousness of our people, destroys their health. We see a crimogenic people from way back engaging in the selling of opium to the Chinese and in engaging in opium wars. We see this drug trafficking group of people engaging in alcohol addiction when they used it to destroy Indians, when they used it to destroy African chiefs who under the influence of the alcohol often signed away their peoples and their nations. We accuse it of drug addiction and drug trafficking when it traded guns for drugs to carry on its warfare in Central and South America. We accuse it of being a criminal nation, a criminal people, a criminal nation, a crimogenic society, when it engages in gun running across the world, when it sells the very weapons that will be used to destroy its own sons and daughters. We accuse it of criminality when it acts to maintain an evil military-industrial complex. We accuse it of being a criminal society when it sells its death wares across the world. How many of us recognize that we are dealing here with merchants of deaths? That these people are dead and deadly. People who are robbing black people at home so that they can rob black people abroad. We accuse this nation of being a crimogenic society and the ruling white population of being a criminal people because they engage in economic extortion, taxation of black people without representation, the redlining of black communities as they steal the savings and investment of black people, as they disinvest in the black community, as they do not return loans to the black community and use the monies that the black communities and the black church place in their coffers to export jobs out of the community into suburbs beyond to the reach of the black population, when they export jobs outside of the country totally and starve our black men and women in Detroit and the other urban centers of this world. We accuse them of economic extortion when they deindustrialize this nation and ship out the blue-collar jobs that maintain the families of black people across this country and ship them to other places and exploit the other populations of this world. We accuse them of imperial criminality and of organized crime. This nation is an organized mafia operation. I have indicated to you that it is best when you look at the international situation that you will come away with a better understanding if you apply the concepts of mafia psychology to the international relations that are going on right now and that have been going on. We don't have time to talk about a chapter I do in here that I call quantifying the myth. You know, the myth of making black people appear to be more criminal than white people. A myth that is statistically supported by the number of black men and women arrested, by the number of black men and women incarcerated, by the number of black men and women under probation and parole. And of course now we are supposed to look at those statistics and compare them between black and white. And because we see more blacks arrested, more blacks in jail, more blacks in probation and parole, we are supposed to make the illogical assumption that blacks are more criminal than whites. I've told you time and time again, ladies and gentlemen, that in a society that's based on lies, as this one is, in a society that can only exist based on deception, that truth is reversed. That's in essence what a lie is. And therefore, when you look at the so-called statistics that seek to establish the criminality of black people, turn it around and turn them around, and you will recognize that the criminals are outside the prisons. We don't have time to talk about it tonight, but that's the value of having power, you see. You can make criminal whatever you want to make it. You can legitimize your own criminality and perverseness. You can call virtue a crime and arrest people for being virtuous. And then you can look at the statistics and say, aren't they more criminal because they are in jail? Some of you read the recent situation here in the Hasidic community where a bunch of Jews ran out, broke arms, and hurt the police, about 2 or 3 dozen policemen. This, of course, comes after a time when they broke into a police precinct station and ransacked it. How many of those people went to jail? How many got fingerprinted? How many of them are in prison? And so forth. And yet, can we say that they did not commit a crime? You see, what do we have here then? A situation, you see, where if you use crime statistics, you're not going to find those Hasidic Jews in the statistics. You're not going to find them on the prison rolls. You see, that's what power does for you, isn't it? It permits you to commit a crime and keep yourself out of jail. And then you can go into the jailhouse and look at the statistics and compare the number of blacks arrested on probation, on parole, and compare them with Hasidic Jews. And say, well, I see one is very big and the other one is very little. Therefore, the blacks must be more criminal than the Hasidic Jews. You can never be more wrong in your life. You have to understand. But we have to get away from that. You know, and this is the kind of teaching that goes on in the university today. Understand that when white boys and white girls are not on the rolls, the prison rolls, and in the prison populations, it points to the efficiency of their criminal organization. How do we say that? A mafia don who has a very efficient criminal operation, who can create a murder incorporated, who can engage in drug trafficking and killing and murdering and extortion, the same kind of games I've been reading to you here tonight, can earn so much money until he can keep his children innocent. Keep them out of jail, give them good educations, and the whole bit. You understand what I'm getting at? In other words, those children's names do not appear on the crime blotters. They are not in the jails because their fathers are such good mafia operators. So even their innocence speaks to the efficient criminality of their fathers. And because then the white boys are not in jail with the black boys, do not make the assumption that means the white boys are less criminal or their fathers are less criminal. It means they just have a criminally efficient operation. We got to move on here. This country then is an imperialist criminal operation because it robs the people at home, and you see it as it robs the people abroad. It constricts the black males to fight its criminal wars. It maintains worldwide terror and extortion. It, of course, maintains the criminality in Namibia, South Africa, Angola, Panama, Grenada, Central South America, Zaire, and the whole bit. I accuse this nation of being a criminal nation because it engages in the health neglect of our people. This nation, as determined by its own task force, indicates that black and minority health, in the area of black and minority health, there are 60,000 more minority deaths per year based on an expectation of equal death rates for blacks and whites. As a matter of fact, melanin gives you an added lifespan. So what are we saying here? That this society, due to its neglect of the health of black people, accesses the lives of some 60,000 black people a year. This is murder. It engages in child neglect and child abuse, as it maintains the infant mortality rate of black children to more than twice that of white children, as it maintains a measles rate 16 times that of white children, as it maintains the poverty of our black children, increasing the poverty of black children at the rate of some 750,000 children a year. It engages in educational neglect, as it engages in the miseducation of our children, as it refuses to fund the Head Start and early childhood education programs, as it refuses to fund the education programs under Chapter 1. And I wish I had the time to read the statistics here of how our children are killed and our families are destroyed through educational neglect. This criminal society then sets up the psychology of black-on-black violence by creating a sense of powerlessness in our young people, by projecting negative stereotypes upon their mentality such that they seek to escape an African identity and alienate themselves from their African selves and internalize the values and perceptions projected by the dominant society, as their appetites are distorted so that they literally then eat themselves to death or desire things which will destroy them, as it frustrates them such that in their anger they turn against themselves, as it makes them displace their anger against their fellow victims. This society is a crimogenic society because it serves as the best model of criminality. The black-on-black criminal has learned from the best of teachers, the white-on-black criminal. It engages in criminality as it supplies weaponry to our children and alcohol and drugs. How does this relate then to our adolescents? Recognize that almost 50% of the young men who die between 15 and 24 die as a result of homicide, black-on-black homicide. This would be a major health problem if we were another ethnic group. Recognize that the cream of the African race is being destroyed before it has a chance to reach manhood. Homicide is the leading cause of death of black males between 15 and 24. Is it because, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the demographic situations in this country, we are producing and outproducing white people in terms of children. Must understand that, at a rate of almost 3 or 4 to 1. The Hispanics are outproducing them about 5 or 6 to 1. That means the larger part of the up and coming population is going to be black and Latino. And these people have already written about the birth dearth. And so what do we have here then, ladies and gentlemen? The destruction of a race and the destruction of that group that would move us toward being a majority in this country. So this has a lot to do with adolescence, and adolescence, of course, is a major point in the development of an individual's life, because it is during adolescence that the self-concept is being developed, that the individual is undergoing an identity crisis, a gender identity crisis, that the individual is dealing with the issues of self-esteem, dealing with the issues of body image, which is the reason why you see them getting caught up in clothes and other adornments. It is the period of time when an individual looks for social affirmation and social acceptance and looks forward to social belongingness. It is a period of time when the emotions are labile and unstable, and therefore the individual is seeking to bring his emotional, sexual, and other drives under control. It is a period of time when the individual is wrestling with social acceptance, wrestling with alienation from the adult society, the society in general, and alienation from itself. It is the time when the person is engaged in intellectual development. It is a time when the individual is asking and trying to deal with moral questions and make vocational choices. It is a time of egocentrism, a time of status striving and being concerned with clothing and cars and other things. It is time when the person deals with invidious comparisons. That is, how do I make myself look good by making other people look bad? And therefore, when you look at this social system, it strikes our youngsters at their most vulnerable periods of their lives and seeks to transform them. Now you may say, some of you who are older, well, you know, we wrestled with the same thing. But keep this in mind, you see, that though these issues are issues that may have been a part of my generation and earlier generations, that these issues are taking place within a different social political context. They're taking place within a different socio-economic historical context. And it is these contexts that combine to determine whether these issues will develop into positive outcomes, negative outcomes, or conflicting and ambivalent outcomes. So today's black adolescents, particularly the poverty-stricken adolescent, exist in a world that is quite different from the world of his parents. Very different from the world even of the 50s and 60s, because we have a youth now that is engaged in the post-industrial age. When you dropped out of school, there were jobs waiting in some factory or on some shipyard or some other place for you. Those jobs are not there today. And so you have to recognize that these youngsters are dealing with a different world. The computers weren't there when you dropped out at the time and when you miseducated yourself. These are children who are engaged in an information age. These are children who are engaged in a highly urbanized world. These are no longer farm boys and rural people from the rural South, caught up in their rural communities. These are kids raised in the ghettos, in the projects, and in the poverty-stricken areas of the urban cities. These are children then that are raised in an information data processing world, a world of television and mass media, a mass media that recognizes that they have money or they can get money. And now a world that instead of just selling to adults, makes teenagers its major marketing audience, and therefore creates desires and wishes, and plays the cruel hoax on our teenagers, of provoking their desires through TV, through singers, through Ray Charles talking about Pepsi, to black religious music, and then does not provide them the means by which They are to get the thing by which their appetites have been provoked to desire. Recognize this then, ladies and gentlemen. Recognize that we are dealing at a time of rising expectations. You see, when we grew up, we knew that there were certain slots for us, and we didn't have to worry about the other ones. Now we live in a world of rising expectation. Be the best that you can be. Be all that you can be. And we see the result of that. These youngsters are living in a time of family dissolution. Remember, the largest percentage of black children up to the 1950s were raised in a two-headed family. Now we are dealing with children where the vast majority of families are single-headed and in poverty and caught in their situations. So don't be too quick to put yourself in this place and compare yourself in your time to the children in this time. You're dealing with a different time. We're dealing in a time of conservative governments and a conservative world situation. We are dealing in a time of world and national demographic changes. These children are growing up in a time, as we said earlier, where there's an availability of weapons so that they may kill themselves, where the escapist drugs have moved beyond alcohol and twister wine and moved into devastating crack, and a type of drug now that didn't involve hustling 50 cents to get a bit of Thunderbird, but that now must involve constant hustling, robbery, and even death to get a whiff of crack. A type of drug situation and an escapist drug situation that creates a totally different social structure, a totally different attitudinal structure, such then that the black community is held in terror and families are being destroyed and robbed by their own sons and daughters. Recommendations, we have to go quickly here, but I'm going to get it in. You'll have to catch me at another time. Yet, and we had to, but I've got to mention the recommendations at least, because we have to move beyond analysis. So let me quickly just run through these. Pardon me if I'm going fast here. If this is a climogenic society, and it is, then we recognize as African people that our major problem is not being left out of the American mainstream and being left out of the system. We must recognize that we cannot join a criminal system because we will become criminals in it. Colin Powell represents the apotheosis, the ultimate of what a criminal system is. He represents what it means to move up in a criminal society. In moving into that system and becoming integrated in it and assimilated with it, he must now become allied with this criminality. And if that system then is dependent upon the death and damnation of black people, upon the imperial subordination of black people, then those like Colin Powell that move up in this system must also then engage in the death and damnation of black people as well. We have to keep that in mind. You're not moving up into this system as it is unless you're also moving against the interests of black people. And therefore you have to recognize that the goal of our people in this crimogenic society is to change the very nature of the social system, to tear it apart and to reconstruct it, to bring into being that word that Bush stole from us, a new world order. Our mission is much higher than assimilating into this system. It must be to create a new world. If this crimogenic society creates a sense of powerlessness in our children, then we must, as a people, develop and use our power. We must take power and train our youth for taking and expressing power positively. If this system destroys the attitudes of our people through projection and projecting on them criminality, we must inoculate our children against evil white projections by inoculating them with truth and the truth of themselves, inoculating them with self-knowledge. We must inoculate them against projection and the internalization of negative attitudes by getting them into the knowledge and the psychology and the ways of their white enemies, and getting them to have an efficient perception of reality and remove their deceptions. If they are alienated from themselves and are infused by an evil white spirit who is implanted in their minds and bodies to serve the will of its devilish masters, then we must reclaim our African-centered identity, and we must reclaim an African-centered consciousness, and we must learn to love ourselves and love each other and engage in cooperation and communalism. This is how we prevent alienation. If the society twists our desires and makes us desire the things that destroy us and hate the things that advance our interests, we must learn a new set of values, inculcate deep and abiding cultural goals, learn to discern when one is being manipulated and exploited. Our children must learn the mechanisms of advertising, mass hypnosis, subliminal suggestion, conditioning, and lies and propaganda. They must learn to be productive so that they can produce for their own desires. They must learn to assume the ownership of the means of production and learn self-control. If the society moves our children into black-on-black violence because it engages them in frustration and the dealing with their frustration in incorrect ways, then we must train our children to be task-oriented, to solve the causes of problems and not engage in dealing with the symptoms of problems. We must teach them to discern the sources of their frustration and remove those sources and tear them out from the root. We must teach them how to use their anger and aggressive feelings positively. Every emotion that is in the human mind is there for a positive reason, and they must be used for positive reasons. Anger is a positive emotion if it is used correctly. So is aggression. God did not put anger and aggression in you just for negative purposes alone, but we must be taught how to use those things. We must teach them to be resourceful and how to get around those frustrations, to develop social intelligence, skills, and competence. We must teach them coping strategies for stress. If they displace their anger and use their anger to attack themselves and destroy themselves and to destroy others like themselves, we must get them to know their real enemy. We must get them to recognize that this enemy, this white man, is only a man, that he bleeds and dies like any other man. We must read to him the history of our African fathers as they cut down and mowed down the white man, and how they were only betrayed by their own cupidity. We must have them understand that. Let them read the story of the Egyptians as they cut, the Ethiopians as they cut down the Italian armies, and read the stories of the other Africans as they cut down the white armies. Bush thinks he's gotten away with this little game, but it's not over. It's not over. By the very fact that he engaged in this war, we now know what his game plan is. We now know his weaknesses and his strengths. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, his strength is his weakness. Understand? And we're going to teach our children how to tear up the soft underbelly of this dragon and this monster called white America. I was down at Tuskegee last weekend, and I saw the Chappie James Aerospace Center. Interesting. But one thing we've learned about this war here is that once we get an Air Force, we are ready. And so we're going to set him up. The only thing that got this man across was he was not resisted in the air. And we will meet him in the air and on the ground. Recognize that the white man can be defeated, that he's not invincible. We must teach them that the displacement of anger at self or at others like at ourselves makes matters worse and is self-destructive. If they are having problems with their self-concept, then we must give them great support. We must affirm them and affirm their identity. We must teach them confirmations so that they know how to make positive statements to themselves and affirm themselves. We must teach them how to stop negative thoughts and change the nature of the situation that they are in. If they are engaged in violence and black upon black violence, we must teach them how to resolve conflict between themselves without destroying themselves. It means then that we have to develop relevant educational programs. We have to develop a parallel school system. We have to make this government, by hook or crook, fund the health care systems of the local and state localities of our people. We must emphasize prevention in the black community, change the lifestyles of our people who are literally eating themselves to death, or whose lifestyles are literally destroying their health. My next book is going to be on black health, by the way, and I'm going to show how the death wishes, how we carry out the death wishes of whites through our eating and health habits. Because they wish that we will die, we accommodate them by drinking too much Pepsi and all the other things. We're going to emphasize critical problems. We must develop programs to ensure adequate prenatal counseling and care. We must develop systems to neutralize the crimogenic system. We must set it our goal, not the assimilation to the society, but the elimination of this society as it is. We must set as our goal economic development, the development of the economic status of our people across this world. We must engage in the development of a nation within a nation. How can a people keep saying that they are kept out of this society and are separated and segregated from this society and not use that to their advantage and create a nation within a nation and get ready to fight the other evil nation in the society? We must engage our people in consumer education, withdraw from those entities and those industrial systems and so forth that are a part and parcel of the destruction of the black community and the communities of Africans. We have to stop buying those Nike sneakers and Reebok sneakers that sell 70% of their wares to black people while they refuse to even franchise black stores to sell those sneakers. We must stop buying Ford Motor Company cars when they take out those car factories from Detroit and import them into Polish and other neighborhoods. And after we get through with Ford, we stop buying GM. And after we get through with GM, we stop buying Toyota and the rest. We will not subsidize the destruction of our people. We must develop an African-centered, full African-centered educational program. We must educate our males. It is very important that we pull these males aside and train them for manhood, train them for husbandhood and fatherhood, and train them for the military so that they undertake the overthrow of the system. We must engage our young people in political education so that they will learn how to engage in the political overthrow of their enemies and organize themselves politically. We must train those of us who want to go into this church into a new theology, that it is not enough to paint, the face of Jesus or to paint the face of angels and still believe in the same Eurocentric ideology and theology. We must go into these prisons and take our men from these prisons. These are the men who must be used to defend our community. They must be rehabilitated on the lines of an African-centered philosophy and on political lines and military lines so that they can use their aggression now, not against themselves or against the nation of African people, but against the true enemies of African people, the white man. We must develop regional conferences in our nation within a nation and a national congress so that we can coordinate and facilitate the talents of our people who are engaged in various aspects of the political, social, and economic reorganization of this country. We must build schools for leadership. We must build schools that engage in policy development and analysis, and schools for developing strategy, schools for developing a military machine to protect us against the interests of Europeans. Recognize that there's one thing that's clear, that the imperialistic system has only one constant, and that is self-interest. And when it is in its self-interest to destroy and wipe black people from the face of this earth, it will engage in that activity. You have the history of the Indians in America to show that when a people are economically not useful to the Europeans proceed to annihilate those people. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we must prepare for revolution and prepare for war. Thank you very much.
Wilson. And we're going to entertain questions. Excuse me a second. Hold on a second, please. We have your attention. Two things. One, I want to forewarn you of the program next Friday. It'll be George Bush's New World Order, neo-fascism, old-fashioned white racism, and Western imperialism recolonization. It will deal with also a comparative analysis of certain leaders in the world and Adolf Hitler, to answer a question put forward before by some last year sometime by Brother Egbert Hall, of who Hitler is, or who is the new Hitler. So we're going to deal with that next week. One of the speakers who will be invited is Lenny Brenner to discuss Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of Israel, and his past relationships with Nazism and fascism. And the other speakers are still being organized, so that's next week. Okay, what we want to do is have questions for those people who have questions. The microphone to use is right over there. You know, we're going to have to hold up on the signing of the books because you can't answer questions and sign the books at the same time. You ready?
Yeah, becoming correction officers and how it changes their attitude. I used to promote the idea to try to get brothers to go into the police force and to go into the army and be correction officers with the idea of trying to get people on the inside. What do you think about that idea after, with the present situation now? Do you still think do you think that is a good idea, or is it something that we should not even bother to undertake?
It's a good question. It's just that I think that between the brother and myself, not to be disrespectful, but I think it was definitely adequately answered. I think the question was answered in that to become a part of this system is to become a part of a criminal enterprise. Okay? From my personal experience, it's as I said, the house Negro has done more to usurp the potential growth and development of the black liberation struggle than actually the white man has. And I'm talking about in my time as a Panther and as a soldier in the liberation struggle. Because white folks didn't know what 8 points of attention was, not until the house nigga went and told them. You see? And these house Negro guards are put in these plantations for the express written purpose of being able to interpret certain idiosyncrasies along Afrocentric lines that the white man, even today, is incapable of interpreting within the context of perhaps insurrection, etc. Okay, just to show you how confident these crackers are. I was sitting over there, I was talking with Alambe, right? And I was telling him that according to military science, black people and prisoners in particular, because in this country, this government has the right to kill prisoners if this country is going to be, it looks like it's going to be overthrown, okay? So they have the right to kill prisoners because we might have some hostility toward this government that gave us injustice, etc., and put us on those plantations, okay? But now we would also represent a fifth column if we were organized, as the brother so eloquently spoke. Why? Just to show you how these crackers feel, they weren't worried about us doing anything, because they sent a whole contingent to the Persian Gulf, and they weren't worried about a national insurrection, because they know we ain't gonna do nothing. They know we ain't gonna do nothing but jump up and down, talk crazy, march, and threaten white folks. You see? And that's the game of this whole thing, man. See, because, you know, I promised my oldest daughter, she's 28, I said, you know, I'm not gonna do no more talking. And I very seldom even do this. Alambe can tell you, because man, listen, man, I'm tired of talking, man. You know what I'm saying? I haven't done that much talking. You know, the talking I do, man, is like Mao said, it should be clearly understood that all major decisions will be decided on the battlefield. See, and you see, it's sad. I don't want to belabor the point, but it's sad because the doctor spoke very clearly that to become a part of this operation, man, is to be a criminal. You see, because it was a criminal enterprise, it was a criminal intent in its initial stages of development. Okay, it was criminal then to put the same kind of chain, when they put the chains on brothers and sisters and brought them here, it's the same chains that they put on us to bring us from here to Clinton. And it's the same people putting them on the same people. Now, like Malcolm said, see, the house Negro represents the Novocaine, like Malcolm was talking about when the doctor's going to take your tooth and he squirts some Novocaine in your mouth to make them think you're not doing anything to you. Now it's the house Negro putting the chains on you in the name of the slave master's law to make you think that they're not doing anything to you or that you're going to get a better treatment. But I've seen incidents and have been involved, personally involved in incidents wherein the slave master had to come and drag Tom off from beating a brother to death. Now last year they killed 4 brothers in the Bing right here in New York City, in HDM. They killed 4 brothers in that Bing, man, beat to death. There was a Captain Litchfield who was a known member of the Nazi Party, and when IG Inspector General's office had him moved due to the efforts of people like Alambe, Sonny Carson, and Quasi kept Roger Green. Assemblyman Roger Green from my district in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. It had this cracker moved. Well, the vendettas that was carried out subsequent to that move was carried out by a black captain named Captain Eric Durbin with his whole crew, and he's a house nigger. You see what I'm saying? And what they do is they come by your cell to, well, it depends. Sometimes they'll come by like soon as the big, see, like you get 1 hour recreation every day. When you come in from the yard, they let each brother out one at a time to take a shower. What they usually do is wait till you get in the shower, and they roll on you, and I'm talking about beat you down. You see, so the house nigga, he loved the master more than the master loves himself. If the master gets sick, he say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick." If the master's house gets on fire, he try to put it out with his hand. I'm the field nigga. I pray that the master die, and I've made sure that the master died on past occasions. You see what I'm saying? And I'm not afraid to do it again. Okay? Peace.
I'll deal with one now.
On behalf of this great African community, we would like to thank you for this magnificent lecture that you have given us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
There are 2 short questions.
Number 1, when will you be returning? Number 2, to those of us who are not cognizant of this new world order, kindly enlighten us as to how South Africa fits in with the new world order. Thank you.
I will leave that third question to Brother Kalambe, whose specialty it is, and who's now in the process of developing a paper around the New World Order, and we'll fit that in. I want to speak in part to the first part of the question as well, in terms of the situation of our people in the police department and the prison systems. And I just say, of course, we have to start, we have to start assuming authority in our own community and policing our own community, number 1. The other thing is that most of these, what we call house Negroes and people who are employed in these prisons, get away with what they do because the black community does not have a punitive arm outside of those prisons. And if we could set up a network between those that are in and those that are outside, and when those brothers leave for the evening who are abusing our people in, and they know that they have to deal with a community, and there was an arm to deal with their betrayal of their interest, of the interests of our people, then we can begin to transform this situation. To a very great extent, the people who betray us get away with what they do get away with because they do not fear us as a people. When they are made to fear this black community, and when they learn that this black community has an arm that will not permit traitors and betrayers of this community's interests to go home and sleep well at night, then you'll change things. And this is, of course, where we'll have to do some subtle organizing and some other things that we can't talk about in public. But, and this is a part of the African manhood training, and a part of males organizing themselves in such a way so that they can control their own communities by various means. That is a part of being a man too, you know, of being able to cooperate with other men in the interest of the community itself and against its enemies. I will be back, of course, as soon as, you know, we get an invitation and so forth, and you will be seeing me more frequently. As I said earlier, there are times I have to take off to do the writing and the work because it's necessary that we do write and that we do spread the written word, because often you can't cover the detail in lectures and speeches and so forth that you can in books, and people often need the books so they can go back and forth and use them, so that we can set up consultation systems so that we can actually engage in the training of our people for positions. So I've chosen, in a sense, my own orientation then as one that would pretty much engage in writing, and a little later on, of course, engage in the founding of organizations, as I have founded one already, and in the development of consultation services to train trainers. So at the end of a decade, we will have people in control of the leadership and in other places in this country that think along our lines and can move our people toward their betterment. Thank you.
First of all, I co-sign to both what Askia said and what Amos said. I agree with him wholeheartedly. We've said it a long time ago. The reason why we catch all this hell is because people can do this and do it with impunity. But until you have some kind of punitive unit that can make sure that before somebody actually does wrong to our people, they have to seriously consider what the repercussions is going to be. Jerry Rawlings in Ghana was asked one time, when he was out of power, he was still criticizing the civilian government, which was making threats against him. And they asked him, well, aren't you afraid because you're speaking out so much that these people might actually hurt you? He said, no, because I know that if I don't eat breakfast, they won't eat lunch. You know? In other words, it has to be that immediate response. If you don't eat breakfast, if you miss breakfast, they won't make lunch. And when you have a situation like that, people will have to realize what they're doing. To get the point, if you've ever seen the Battle of Algiers, you will see how the whole thing operated. Before the FLNN was able to organize the people in the Kasbah, which was similar to our Bedford-Stuyvesant or our Harlem, the gangster element could actually control the whole community because they could do whatever they wanted to do without anybody trying to stop them for poisoning the community. The community in turn also feared the French because the French was the authority figures who could punish the Algerians if they tried to do any kind of reasonable dissent that they thought was threatening to their interests. But when the FLN started to first move on the gangsters to clean out that element so that there would only be one authority within the Kasbah that would represent the people, not the duality of the gangsters and the revolutionaries, wipe out the gangsters, and then they could respond to the French. The people who were in the community